I should say before I start, because Adam Cooper from the National Infrastructure Commission is going to come and talk about the National Infrastructure Assessment in a minute. And I'm going to talk about the National Needs Assessment. They are two different projects, but I think both trying to achieve the same thing. So just in case you kind of get a little bit confused by that. We started this project back in the summer of 2015. And it was because we had Sir John Armitt coming in as president of the ICE, and there was a real kind of swell of interest around this idea of a long-term approach to infrastructure kind of planning. And at that stage, the National Infrastructure Commission didn't actually exist. So we decided that as an industry leader, we should bring together all of the groups you can see here at the bottom of the screen and actually show some leadership in industry and not just rely on government to do something, but actually set out a kind of a vision for infrastructure until 2050. So that's what we did, and I should just thank a few of the groups here, Atkins, KPMG, Pint St Masons and Oxford University, who put a lot of resource into this work to make it happen. When we set out, our objective was to provide a kind of a blueprint, I guess, to both the government and to the National Infrastructure Commission as to what a kind of a long-term assessment for infrastructure looks like. And we covered a range of sectors: energy, water, waste, transport, flooding, digital and housing as well. We wanted to bring all of those sectors together so that we could provide this kind of integrated cross-sectoral approach to infrastructure. And I think it's really important to make the point that we looked at housing, because often housing is looked at separately from other areas of infrastructure, and we thought it was really, really important to put those two things together, partly because we really should be planning in this kind of interdependent way, but also housing, as well as being something that people kind of need to survive, also puts a big demand on other infrastructure sectors, and I'll come to that later on. Now, we started by setting out our vision to 2050, and as you can imagine, we tried to do this by committee, so trying to get a kind of a pithy kind of statement by committee is quite challenging. We came up with this. I won't read it out, but it was basically about providing economic growth, but balanced economic growth around the UK, driving sustainability and well-being for society and communities, but also shifting towards a low-carbon future. And we also had this piece in here about the UK's position as a global economy. Now, we did this work, we started this work before Brexit happened, and I think it's even more kind of relevant now that you see what government's doing. It's really trying to position the UK and using infrastructure, particularly through things like the modern industrial strategy, to position the UK as a sort of an economic powerhouse. We used some great research from the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium at Oxford University, and we got 55 written submissions throughout industry, ran a series of workshops around the UK, not just in England, but in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and we think we kind of got to about 600 people and 400 organisations throughout the process, so really good evidence gathering and really good engagement. And the first thing we wanted to do was set out what the demand drivers on infrastructure are. UK population by 2050 will be about 75 million. We're looking at UK GDP by 2050 of about 3.7 trillion. But we also looked at some of the barriers at the moment to good infrastructure service, and things like road congestion and the cost it kind of contributes to the UK economy. So 8.6 billion by 2040, that's significant. Also flooding, causing lots of disruption, looking at sort of 900 million, up to $1 billion a year if you talk to some of the insurance companies. Also, just to point out that the aspiration is to build 300,000 homes per year by the end of this decade. We're some way short of that at the moment, but just imagine if we did that, the kind of infrastructure services, and not just economic, but also social services that we would need to complement that. The other big area we were trying to push on here was interdependencies of sectors. And the work that Oxford did really kind of threw up some really interesting areas, that the kind of demands that one sector places on another. So we see things like big data, particularly going into the future, the Internet of Things, digital communications rather, kind of putting big demand pressures on electricity. And things like cooling water for power stations, 28% of water abstracted goes towards that. That's significant. And it's great that we see things like autonomous vehicles, taking place, and government really pushing that, and artificial intelligence. But they do put extra demands on electricity, so we really need to think about that kind of transport, digital, energy nexus as we go forward, because that's really, really key. And as I said, large housing and even small-scale housing puts demands on infrastructure sectors. And I think at the moment we plan those two things separately, and we need to start thinking about them together. We had one big overarching recommendation. That was for government and an NIC to plan collaboratively. We then went into sectors. And we looked at sectors, and we looked at a range of sectors. I'm just going to talk about energy, digital, transport, and housing today, because I'm sort of limited on time. Because we felt that those are the most important kind of four. And we looked at those from both a demand and a supply point of view. So one of the most contentious issues was how involved government gets in energy policy, and we had a lot of debate around the room about whether government should get involved in kind of dictating and setting kind of very, very clear kind of frameworks and figures for electricity generation. We take this diverse mixed approach, we agree with that, but what we've sort of said is actually government should start thinking about where this comes from. Now we wouldn't want to say nuclear must be 25%, so we slightly rode back on that, but we said we've got some sort of benchmarks on where things should come from. And that gets us out to 2035. But then we need to think beyond 2035 and maybe think about some of the technologies that are coming on board, like battery storage. And so we've asked the NIC to go away and look at that, and I know that's something they're looking at as another piece of research. But we also think on the demand side there's a lot to do here in terms of a smart energy system, but also a clear policy from government. I think government's been a little bit kind of inconsistent in terms of efficiency and demand management to date. I think it's important now that they actually set a very, very clear policy and framework to get us to that point. In terms of transport, a lot of what we were looking at was really trying to address current challenges, because we've got lots of capacity problems, lots of pinch points on a number of roads, and I'm not just talking about the big stuff, the strategic roads, but also primary roads and kind of the B roads as well. That's where we see a lot of challenges. We've got a lot of maintenance issues there, a lot of local authorities are having their budgets cut and they're not able to maintain roads, so there's a real need to address those immediate problems. But then looking ahead, we need to start thinking about things like autonomous vehicles, how we actually fund our roads, because things like vehicle excise duty are going down, and they don't necessarily pay directly for roads. So how about thinking about if we bring autonomous vehicles online, how can we kind of use the kind of sort of modern thinking kind of funding approaches to generate revenue that actually pays for the roads, and also perhaps addresses some of the demand issues, some of the demand challenges we have on our roads as well. I think it's also important that we say that technology plays a big part in terms of the way we manage our road system. There's no point in us investing in extra capacity, putting more money into maintenance if we find that in 10 years down the road, excuse the pun, we're just in the same congestion problems that we're already in now. In terms of digital, this is very much a private sector driven piece. And I think government's done a good job in kind of putting a digital strategy out there and trying to support. Government's an enabler here, and we recognise that. But there are areas where government perhaps should get involved, not necessarily in delivering the infrastructure, but providing some extra incentives for those sort of 5 or 10% of areas, particularly rural areas, that don't currently enjoy the kind of broadband services that we see elsewhere, particularly in urban areas. But we also think that digital really is the most important, perhaps alongside energy, sector that underpins all other infrastructure. And we see things like AI coming on tap, Internet of Things. They're really going to drive changes in the way we manage, operate, and use our infrastructure going forward. So we asked the NIC last October to look at a kind of a technology digital piece that looks at the requirements of other sectors, and I'm pleased that they've started undertaking that project. And then finally, housing. And as I said, one of the challenges of housing is it's considered separately from other infrastructure, and we think the two things need to be joined up together. So in terms of major housing proposals, we think that they should be considered as part of the nationally significant infrastructure projects. And we looked at housing units of 5,000 plus to fall into that category. That just means that they can get through the planning process a little more easily, and they get a bit more government support as they go through. We clearly need to accelerate the provision of housing, not just in areas where we see lots of population growth at the moment, but looking at how we do that right across the UK. So we're making places attractive for people to live. And then look at the kind of public land that's available and how we unlock that with other infrastructure. So just to look back, what we were trying to achieve was to, at the start was to kind of give this blueprint. And I think, 5 months on from launching the NNA, I think it's fair to say we've had some success. The National Infrastructure Commission is now working on its National Infrastructure Assessment, and Adam's going to talk about that in a bit more detail. But they've also looked at studies around demand drivers, but also digital issues. The autumn statement last year was absolutely ram-packed with announcements on infrastructure, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of what the group that pulled together the National Needs Assessment asked for was delivered, particularly things like the National Productivity Infrastructure Fund, which looked at how digital could link up with housing and transport. So we were really pleased with that. And it'll be interesting to see what's in the budget tomorrow, but I think we're just pleased to see what was in the autumn statement. And finally, we've got an industrial strategy with infrastructure as one of the core pillars at the heart of it. So clearly infrastructure is seen as a way of driving productivity, of driving growth and driving thriving securities across the UK, particularly now that we're entering a kind of, a new phase in terms of Brexit. Thank you.